Everyone mocked a mountain man for taking a blind wife until they saw her on the wedding night. The wind over Wind River Valley was sharp that morning, the kind that bit through wool and rattled the weathered shutters of every crooked storefront in town. A dust devil spun across the main road, swirling grit against wagon wheels and the legs of passing horses. It was an ordinary day until Eli Carver's wagon rolled down the trail. Eli had always been a man apart. Folks called him the mountain ghost, not because they feared him, but because he rarely came down from the high country, except when winter forced him to trade his pelts. He was a big man, built like the mountains he called home, his shoulders broad beneath a coat of rough elk hide, his face shadowed by a beard that looked more like the wilderness than the man himself. But this time, the wagon wasn't filled with furs or firewood. It held a woman. She sat quietly beside him, bonnet drawn low, gloved hands resting neatly in her lap. Her name, though few in Wind River knew it yet, was Lydia. The wagon wheels crunched over the packed dirt as Eli pulled his team to a stop outside Dawson's Mercantile. Every hammer in town seemed to pause mid-strike. Every conversation quieted. From the blacksmith shop to the saloon porch, faces turned. "Is that Carver?" someone whispered. "Looks like him," another muttered. "Ain't seen him since Christmas." "What's he got with him?" A ranch hand stepped closer, squinting. "A woman? I'll be damned. Who'd marry that wild bear?" Laughter rippled through the group, rough and easy. The saloon door swung open, and out stepped Tommy Pike, a man who prided himself on knowing every rumor before it reached the next porch. He leaned on a post and grinned. "Well, boys," he said loud enough for the street to hear, "looks like Carver's been up in them hills too long. Can't find a woman who can see what he's gotten himself into." The laughter came again, sharper this time. Eli didn't respond. He tied off the reins and walked around the wagon to help Lydia down. The woman moved with careful grace, her steps light but certain, until her foot found uneven ground. Her hand twitched toward Eli's arm, and he caught her gently, steadying her. That's when the onlookers noticed. Her eyes, pale gray and distant, didn't focus on anything at all. She smiled faintly, her face turned toward the voices but not toward their faces. "She's blind," someone blurted. A wave of murmurs followed, thick with disbelief and pity. "Blind as a bat. What kind of man marries that? He must have lost his mind living up there alone." Lydia's hand tightened briefly on Eli's arm. She didn't speak, didn't frown, but the small tremor in her fingers said she heard every word. Eli glanced at the men, his expression calm, too calm. He had that mountain stillness about him, the kind that made others uneasy. "You done?" he asked, voice low, rough as gravel. The laughter died immediately. No one answered. Eli guided Lydia up the boardwalk toward the Mercantile, his hand resting protectively at her back. Inside, the warmth of the pot-belly stove met them, and old Clara Dawson, the shopkeeper's wife, nearly dropped her ledger when she saw them. "Mr. Carver, I didn't expect." She stopped when Lydia turned her head toward the sound of her voice, smiling softly. "Good morning," Lydia said. Her voice was calm, musical even, like she rehearsed grace in the face of cruelty all her life. Clara hesitated. "Good morning, dear. What can I get you today?" "Just flour and a little sugar," Lydia replied. "And a few candles, if you have them." Eli waited while she spoke, his eyes never leaving her face, not in the way of a man who pitied, but one who protected. Outside, Tommy Pike leaned to the doorway, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Hey, Carver, you need me to write her order down for you? Don't want the poor thing picking the wrong sugar by mistake." The store went quiet again. The only sound was the creak of the floorboards under Eli's boots as he turned to face the man. "She don't need your help," Eli said, his voice so even it made the air itself feel colder. Tommy laughed nervously, but he took a half step back when Eli's eyes locked on him. When they finally left the store, Lydia carried the small sack herself, refusing Eli's offer to take it. "I can manage," she said softly, feeling her way along the wagon's side. As Eli helped her climb back up, she whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "They don't know what to do with what they don't understand." He looked up at her, the faintest smile touching his lips. "Let him talk." The mountains don't listen to fools. They left Wind River under a rising dust storm. From the saloon, a few men stood watching as the wagon disappeared toward the foothills, Lydia's bonnet barely visible through the swirling grit. "She won't last a month up there," one said. Tommy snorted. "If she don't freeze, she'll fall off a cliff." Another muttered, "Or he'll bring her back when he's had enough of babysitting a blind woman." But Clara Dawson, still standing in her doorway, said quietly, almost to herself, "Or maybe she'll teach him how to see the world different." Her words were lost in the wind, but they would come true soon enough. For in the wild hush of the mountains, beyond the judgment of the town, the mountain man and the blind woman were about to write a story Wind River would never forget. The trail to the mountains wound like a serpent through pine and stone. The farther they rode, the smaller Wind River became behind them, just a smear of roofs and smoke beneath a stretch of endless Wyoming sky. By the time Eli's wagon rattled into the foothills, dusk had painted the peaks in violet and gold. Lydia sat beside him, her hands folded neatly on her lap, the cool wind tugging at her bonnet strings. She could smell the resin of pine, the wet scent of melting snow. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she asked softly. Eli turned surprised. "You can tell." She smiled faintly. "You can smell the cold when it comes off the mountains. You can hear how the air changes. I don't need eyes for that." He said nothing for a while, just looked at her profile against the light. A blind woman who could describe beauty better than any sighted soul he'd ever met. When they finally reached the cabin, the night had fallen thick and quiet. It stood alone on a ridge, built of weathered logs and a stone chimney that leaned slightly to the east. Smoke rose from it, curling like a soft ribbon against the stars. Eli jumped down and helped Lydia from the wagon, his large hand enveloping hers. The moment her boots touched the ground, she hesitated. The air here was different. Quieter, yes, but alive. The whisper of pine needles, the distant cry of an owl, the soft murmur of a nearby creek. "It's peaceful," she breathed. "It's lonely," Eli answered. "Not anymore," she said simply. Inside, the cabin was rough but tidy. A single room with a stone hearth, a sturdy oak table, shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and furs folded neatly in the corner. Everything smelled of wood smoke, leather, and pine sap. Lydia moved carefully, tracing the edge of the table, the coolness of the metal kettle, the warmth from a fire. "You built all this?" she asked. "Every nail," Eli replied. She nodded. "Then it must have been built by someone who doesn't give up easy." Eli busied himself with the stew pot, his movements slow, deliberate. He wasn't used to company, let alone conversation. For years, silence had been his only companion. But now, the cabin felt smaller and somehow warmer. Lydia sat near the fire, folding her hands in her lap. "You know," she said, "I wasn't born blind." Eli looked up from the pot. "It came after fever," she continued, her voice soft, steady. "I remember the last thing I ever saw. It was rain on a window, the way it moved, like the sky was crying. After that, I only saw darkness." Eli leaned back against the counter. "You ever wish you could see again?" She smiled sadly. "Sometimes, but I've learned the world tells you plenty if you stop looking and start listening." He stared into the fire for a long moment. "You talk like someone who's made peace with it." She tilted her head toward him. "And you talk like a man who hasn't made peace with anything." The words hit him harder than she could have known. After supper, they sat in silence. Lydia could sense his presence, the shift of his weight, the way his boots scuffed the floor. "You've lived here alone for years," she said finally. "Why?" Eli poked at the fire. "Because the mountains don't ask questions. And the people in town do." He gave a short laugh. "You heard him. They talk too much." "Maybe," she said softly, "but sometimes people talk because they don't understand quiet men." Eli turned toward her, studying her pale, sightless eyes. There was no pity in her face, no fear, only calm acceptance. She reached out suddenly, her hand brushing the air until it found his arm. "Your hands," she said. "They feel like stone." He blinked. "From work." She smiled faintly. and from carrying too much. For the first time in years, Eli didn't know what to say. Outside, the night deepened. Wolves howled far off in the distance, their cries echoing down the valley. Lydia tilted her head toward the sound. "Doesn't that scare you?" she asked. "No," Eli said. "They're just hungry." "Then you and they have something in common," she replied, smiling softly. He couldn't help but chuckle, a sound so rare it startled even him. "You got some fight in you." "I wouldn't have survived without it," she said quietly. Later, when she retired to the bed by the window, Eli lingered by the fire. He could hear her slow, steady breathing as she drifted off to sleep. In that moment, something stirred in him, something he hadn't felt in years. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't fragile. She was something else entirely, a woman who could walk through darkness and still find the light in others. He found himself whispering to the flames, "They think I saved her. Truth is, she's the one savant me." Outside, the wind picked up, sweeping snow from the peaks and across the roof of the cabin. The mountains stood silent, listening, as if they, too, knew that something rare had begun that night. The morning of the wedding broke cold and gray, with clouds hanging low over the Wyoming peaks like a heavy wool blanket. The wind had the bite of late winter in it, sweeping dust down Main Street and clattering the loose sign of the Silver Spur Saloon. Wind River was never a gentle place, and mercy was a currency few could afford. When Eli Carver rode in with Lydia that morning, the town stirred like a nest of rattlesnakes. Every door creaked open, every curtain twitched. Folks leaned on fences and hitching posts just to get a look at the sight that had stirred so much talk these past 2 weeks. The mountain man and his blind bride. "She's really going through with it," whispered a woman from behind a general store window. "Guess so," another replied. "Reverend Moss says they'll be wet before noon." "Well, bless her heart. She must not know what she's getting into." "She can't see what she's getting into," a man snorted, and laughter followed like a whip crack. Eli ignored them all, his jaw set like stone. Lydia sat beside him, bonnet tied beneath her chin, her posture straight despite the biting wind. She could hear the voices, every whisper, every cruel chuckle, and though her heart hammered, she held her head high. When they stopped outside the chapel, she reached for Eli's arm. "Is it bad?" she asked softly. He hesitated, glancing at the crowd that had gathered, townsfolk in their Sunday coats, watching as though the wedding were a sideshow. "It's just folks," he said finally. She smiled faintly. "Then I'll pretend they're kind." The chapel was small, whitewashed walls, wooden pews polished by years of hands, a single cross above the altar. Inside, Reverend Moss stood waiting, Bible in hand, his expression uncertain but kind. "Eli," he greeted, nodding respectfully. "Miss Lydia." "Soon to be Mrs. Carver," she said softly, stepping forward with surprising confidence. They stood at the altar as the congregation murmured behind them. Most hadn't come to bless the union. They had come to witness the spectacle. Tommy Pike sat in the back row, hat tipped low, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Well, I'll be," he whispered to the man beside him. Didn't think Carver'd actually go through with it. A blind wife might as well marry a ghost. Eli heard the snicker, but kept his eyes forward. His hand brushed Lydia's, and she tightened her fingers around his. Reverend Moss cleared his throat, trying to keep the ceremony steady. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here." The old floorboards creaked as someone shifted uncomfortably. A cough echoed. Then, just as the Reverend reached the vows, a voice from the back called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, Carver, you sure she ain't marrying you just to get free firewood?" Laughter erupted, sharp, ugly, echoing to the small church. Lydia didn't move. Her chin lifted slightly, her lips parting just enough to take a slow, calm breath. But her fingers trembled against Eli's hand. Eli turned, slow as thunder forming over the ridge. His eyes locked on Tommy Pike, whose grin faltered the moment it met the mountain man's stare. "You done?" Eli asked quietly. The room fell silent. Even Reverend Moss froze mid-sentence. Eli's voice was low, even, but it carried through every inch of that chapel. "This woman came here to make a promise before God. You came to make a fool of yourself. So far, you're doing fine." A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. Tommy opened his mouth, but the words died there. Lydia's hand tightened again, not out of fear, but to steady him. "Eli," she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. "Don't give them your anger. Let them choke on their own." He drew a long breath, turned back toward her, and nodded slightly. "All right," he murmured. "All right." The Reverend, flustered but moved, cleared his throat again and continued. "Eli Carver, do you take this woman?" "I do," Eli said without hesitation. "And Lydia, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Lydia's voice, when it came, was steady and bright as a mountain spring. "I do, with all that I am, even what I can't see." The Reverend smiled faintly and said, "Then by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." Eli leaned down, his voice rough with emotion. "They'll choke on their word someday." Lydia smiled through tears that caught the light like glass beads. "Let them," she whispered. "I don't need them to see me, only you." He kissed her, gently, reverently, and for a moment, the entire church went silent. It was brief, but it was enough to shake something loose in those watching. A few women lowered their eyes. Reverend Moss looked proud, and even Tommy Pike, red-faced, looked away. Outside, the wind had changed direction. Clouds were breaking apart, letting sunlight spill down through the valley. Eli lifted Lydia onto the wagon once more. As they rode away, the whisper started again, but softer now, uncertain. "I didn't expect her to be well-spoken. She's got spirit, I'll give her that. And Carver, never seen him look at anyone like that." By the time they disappeared up the ridge road, the mocking had dimmed into murmurs, and more than one person in Wind River found themselves wondering if maybe, just maybe, they'd been wrong. Back at the cabin, when the last light of day faded and the first stars began to blink above the peaks, Lydia stood by the small window, her hand resting on the glass. "I could feel the sunlight," she whispered. Eli turned from the hearth. "You sure?" "Yes," she said with a quiet smile. "It was warm, like it was blessing us. Maybe heaven saw what they couldn't." He crossed the room and drew her close. The mountain wind howled outside, but inside there was peace. They didn't know it yet, but that day's cruelty would become the foundation of something stronger than pity, stronger than gossip, because the blind woman they mocked had seen something far clearer than the rest. She had seen the heart of a good man, and soon the whole town would learn to see it too. The ride back to the mountains was long and silent. After the cruel whispers of Wind River, the wilderness seemed to welcome them home. Tall pines standing like solemn witnesses, the river murmuring softly beside the trail. Lydia sat beside Eli, hands folded in her lap, her bonnet ribbons fluttering in the cold spring wind. She didn't cry. She didn't scowl. But now and again, she would tilt her head toward the sound of birds or the rustle of branches, as if listening for something only she could hear. At last, the wagon creaked to a halt before the small log cabin perched on the ridge. The smoke from the chimney curled upward into a violet evening sky. To Lydia, it felt like a new world. Though she couldn't see it, she could sense it. The air smelled clean, pine sweet and sharp. The breeze brushed her cheek like a promise. Eli helped her down carefully. "Mind the step," he said. "I can feel the ground," she replied with a soft smile. "It's solid. That's more than I can say for people." He chuckled quietly, surprised again by the humor that lived behind her calm. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth. The firelight danced across rough-hewn timbers, flickering over the shelves lined with jars, pelts, and old tools. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the scent of pine resin, soap, and with smoke filled the air. Eli busied himself with the fire, adding another log, while Lydia stood just inside the doorway, her hand resting on the frame. She seemed to be memorizing the place through sound, the pop of the embers, the faint whistle of wine through the shutters. "It sounds safe here," she said. "It is," he replied. "No one comes this far unless they mean to." "Good," she whispered. "Then we can start new." He turned toward her then, noticing how the firelight turned her pale eyes to molten silver. She reached out one hand uncertainly, and he took it, guiding her toward the chair by the hearth. Sit. I'll fetch supper. When he turned back, she was tracing the air before her, feeling the warmth on her palms. Describe it to me, she said suddenly. He paused. What? This place. Tell me what it looks like. I want to see it the way you do. He hesitated, then spoke, his voice low and rough, like gravel softened by water. It's small, he said, but clean. The fire's got a good flame tonight. There's a quilt on the bed, blue and gray. My mom made it years back. The table's rough-cut pine. Window faces east. You like the sunrise? Lydia smiled faintly. And what about the man who lives here? He shifted, uneasy. He's rough around the edges. Doesn't talk much, but he keeps his word. That sounds like someone I could trust, she said. They ate stew together at the small table. Eli had never thought much about meals. They were just a necessity. But that night, every motion felt different. The clink of the spoons, the way she listened between bites, the careful way she thanked him, all filled the room with something that had been missing for years. Presence. When supper was done, he cleared the dishes, and Lydia stood, feeling her way to the small window. Her fingers brushed the glass. What's out there? She asked. Snow, mostly, he said, and stars if the clouds hold off. She tilted her head. Stars. I remember those. Her voice broke slightly, like a string pulled too tight. Eli turned toward her, but said nothing. I used to sit on the porch back home, she continued softly. I could name every one of them. After I lost my sight, I thought they were gone forever. But sometimes, I still see them when I dream. Eli stepped closer, his shadow falling beside hers. You can still feel them, I reckon. Same way you feel the sun. Doesn't take eyes to know there's light out there. She smiled then, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. He reached out, brushed it away gently with the back of his rough hand. Guess I'm not the only one trying to find his way in the dark, he murmured. That broke something inside both of them, the wall between loneliness and belonging. Later, the wind rose outside, whistling through the pine tops, and the cabin's walls creaked with the weight of the storm. Inside, the fire threw long ribbons of gold across the room. Lydia sat near the hearth, untying her bonnet. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, soft brown, catching the light like silk. Eli watched her quietly, unsure whether to speak. I know what they said about me, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. They think I'm a burden, that you pitied me. He said nothing. But pity isn't what I felt when you took my hand. It was peace. Like someone finally saw me, not what I lost, but what's left. Eli swallowed hard. Lydia, I didn't marry you out of pity. I know. She turned her face toward him, eyes unfocused but warm. You married me because you're the only man in that town who doesn't look away. Silence filled the space between them. Thick, steady, honest. When the fire burned low, he threw on another log, and she said, Come sit. He did, and she reached out until her hand found his. You feel tense, she said softly, like you're always expecting the world to take something from you. He gave a quiet laugh. That's 'cause it usually does. Then let me give something back. She laced her fingers through his, her touch light but certain. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sound was the whisper of the fire and the steady rhythm of the wind outside. The world felt far away. No mocking voices, no gossip. Just two souls who carried their scars up a mountain and found rest in each other's quiet company. Finally, Lydia leaned her head against his shoulder and murmured, You live high enough to touch heaven, Eli. He looked toward the window, where the storm had passed and moonlight spilled across the floorboards. Now, he said, his voice thick with emotion, it feels like I do. They stayed like that for a long time, not as a man and his blind bride, not as a pair of outcasts, but as two people who had finally found a place where the world couldn't reach them. Outside, the mountains loomed silent and watchful, their peaks glowing faintly beneath the moon. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth, a little island of gold in a sea of darkness. And as Lydia drifted into sleep beside the fire, Eli whispered quietly, Let him mock. Let him laugh. They don't know what they're missing, because that night, For the first time in his life, the mountain man wasn't alone. And for the first time since the darkness took her sight, the blind woman could truly see. Spring came late to the Wind River Valley that year. The snows melted slow, and the rivers ran high, carrying the mountain's old secrets down to the plains. Eli had been living up there with Lydia for near 3 months since the wedding, long enough for the town's gossip to turn stale, though the whispers never quite died. They called him the fool who married the blind woman. They called her the poor, pitiful thing who won't last till fall. But life on the ridge told a different story. Every dawn, the rooster's crow would echo through the trees, and Lydia would be awake before the first light touched the peaks. She couldn't see the sunrise, but she felt it. The change in the air, the faint warmth on her face, the sound of birds shaking off the night. Eli would come in from the yard, hands rough with work, and find her already moving to the cabin with quiet grace, stirring the fire, kneading dough, humming softly to herself. She'd learned where every item lay, memorized each creak of the floor, each groove in the table. And sometimes he'd just watch her, not out of pity, out of awe. He'd never seen someone so strong move so gently. One morning she said, "I want to help you build that fence." He laughed softly. "You don't even know where the posts go." She turned toward his voice. "Then show me, one by one." And he did, together. They worked side by side, her measuring the distance with her steps, driving stakes into the soft earth while he guided her hands. The rhythm of their labor became music. The steady tap of the hammer, the creak of rope, the rush of wind through the pines. When they rested, she sat beside him in the grass, sweat glistening on her temples. "I can't see this land," she said, "but I can feel it breathe. It's alive, Eli, just like us." He nodded. "It's stronger cause of you." And he meant it, the invitation. One crisp morning, Eli rode down into town for supplies. The blacksmith, Henry Thorne, paused when he saw him tying his horse. "Well, look who's back from his mountaintop honeymoon," he said, smirking. Eli ignored the jab. "Need nails, lamp oil, and sugar." Henry leaned against the post, eyeing him. "How's the missus? Still fending her way around?" Eli's jaw tensed. "She's doing fine." Henry shrugged. "Heard there's a barn dance Saturday. You bring her along. Folks might stop talking if they see she's—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Eli knew what he meant. "Maybe we will," Eli said evenly, taking the supplies and leaving the man speechless. The night of the dance. By the time Saturday came, the valley had bloomed, wildflowers painting the hillsides in gold and violet. The air smelled of fresh hay and lilac. Lanterns were strung across the Thorne family's big red barn, and the town had gathered in their best clothes. Fiddles played, boots stomped, laughter filled the warm night, and then the door opened. Eli walked in, broad-shouldered and quiet as always, his hand steady on Lydia's arm. She wore a simple cream dress, the one she'd sewn herself, modest, but it caught the light like silk. Her hair was braided loosely, with a few strands falling free around her face. For a moment, silence rippled through the room. The fiddles faltered. Whispers began. "Is that her?" "Bless her heart. She can't even see where she's going." But Lydia stood tall, her fingers resting lightly on Eli's arm. She smiled faintly and said, "I can tell they stopped playing." He chuckled. "Guess they're just staring. Then let's give them something worth looking at." And before he could protest, she took a step forward onto the dance floor. The fiddler hesitated, then struck up a tune, soft at first, like a hesitant apology. Eli held her close, his hand guiding her waist. "You sure about this?" "I can follow your heartbeat," she whispered. They began to move, slow, then steady, the rhythm building as her steps found his. She moved with unshakable trust, her head tilted slightly toward him, her feet gliding across the wooden boards as if she'd danced there her whole life. The crowd went silent again, not in mockery this time, but in awe. She couldn't see the lantern light glimmering in her hair or the way the fireflies hovered just above her shoulders, making her glow like something not quite of this world. But everyone else saw it. When the song ended, the barn erupted in applause. Someone shouted, "Well, I'll be She dances better than any of us." Lydia laughed softly. "That's 'cause I don't waste time worrying where I'll step." The whole place laughed with her then, warm, genuine laughter, the kind that dissolves cruelty. Eli looked around the room and saw faces that had once sneered now softened with shame. Henry Thorne himself stepped forward and said, "Ma'am, I owe you an apology." "We all do." Lydia smiled gently. "No need for that. Just promise me next time you see someone different, you don't look away." The man nodded, hat in hand. The sunrise. The next morning, as the first light crept over the mountains, Eli and Lydia sat on the porch together. The world smelled of dew and earth and pine. "I heard the wind dancing last night," Lydia said softly. "You sure it wasn't me snoring?" Eli teased. She smiled. "No, it was the sound of people changing their hearts." He looked at her, truly looked at her. The woman the world had mocked now sat glowing in the dawn. Her blind eyes opened to something deeper than sight. "You show them what real beauty looks like," he said quietly. She turned her face toward the sun. "Then let's keep showing them." And when the first rays touched her cheeks, lighting her face with gold, Eli thought, knew, that there were men who could stare at sunsets their whole lives and never see what he saw right then. The woman who'd been called blind was the only one who truly saw. That day, the gossip in Wind River changed. Now they said, "You know that mountain man and his wife? They make you believe there's still good in this world." And up on the ridge, Eli carved new words above the cabin door, words that would stay there for generations. "Love sees farther than eyes ever could." The summer that year began warm and bright. The meadows on the ridge shimmered with wildflowers. The streams ran clear, and the cabin felt alive with the rhythm of the mountains. But the mountains were never still for long. By August, dark clouds began to gather. Strange, heavy clouds that clung to the peaks for days. The air grew thick and restless. The wind carried the scent of rain, and something else, the cold, metallic tang of danger. Eli noticed the change first. "The river's running too high," he said one morning, tightening his saddle straps. "I'll ride down, check the bridge before it gives." Lydia stood on the porch, listening to the growl of thunder far off. "Be careful," she said. "The wind sounds angry." He smiled faintly. "I'll be back before dark. Keep the fire going." She nodded, holding his hand for a moment longer than usual before letting go. The warning in the wind. By noon, the skies opened. The rain came in sheets, slashing through the valley, turning the trails to rivers. Eli reached the crossing just in time to see one of the bridge ropes snap, the planks twisting wildly in the current. He cursed under his breath and tied his horse to a pine. For hours, he worked in the rain, soaked to the bone, trying to lash the broken sections back together before the whole thing was swept away. Back at the cabin, Lydia waited, listening to the storm tear through the forest. The wind howled against the shutters, rattling the windows, and every gust made her heart race. She fed the fire, boiled water, tried to pray. But something inside her whispered that the storm wasn't just passing. It was testing them. When night fell and Eli still hadn't returned, she knew something was wrong. She found her cane and coat by touch, tied her shawl tight, and opened the cabin door. The rain stung her face immediately, cold and furious. But she stepped out anyway. "Eli!" she called into the storm. Her voice vanished into the roar of wind and thunder. "Eli!" The search. Down by the river, Eli was trapped. A falling branch had knocked him from the embankment. His leg was pinned between rocks. The water surged around him, icy and merciless. He tried to free himself, but the pain shot white-hot through his side. "Lydia!" he shouted, though he knew she couldn't hear him from this far. And yet, somehow, she did. She couldn't explain it later, but as she stumbled through the forest, her hand brushing wet bark, her feet finding the path by memory alone, she felt where he was. It was as if the same current that had bound them together the night, that was pulling her now, guiding her toward him. At last, through the storm, she heard it, a faint cry carried by the wind. "Eli!" she called again. "Lydia!" She followed his voice down the slope, slipping and falling more than once. Her palms bled, Her dress was soaked through, but she kept moving until her hand brushed cold metal, his saddle buckle. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Oh, thank heaven," she breathed. "I found you." He tried to speak, but the water choked his words. "My leg, can't move it." She reached into the darkness, feeling the rocks around him. "Tell me what to do." "Lever the stone on the right." She fumbled for a fallen branch, wedging it under the rock with trembling hands. Rain blinded her, mud sucked at her knees, but she pushed with everything she had. "Come on," she gasped. "Come on." With a groan, the stone shifted. Eli dragged his leg free, clutching her arm for balance. "Lydia," he rasped, "you shouldn't be come out here." "I told you," she whispered, half sobbing. "I can find you, even in the dark." They stumbled back toward the ridge together, leaning on each other. The storm still raged, lightning flashing through the trees, but they kept moving step by step, until at last the warm flicker of the cabin's fire shone through the rain like a beacon. The long night. Inside, Eli collapsed by the hearth. His leg was badly bruised and swelling, his hands raw. Lydia tore strips from her skirt to bind the wounds. "Hold still," she said. Her voice steady though her hands trembled. "You saved my life," he whispered. "You saved mine first." More than once. Thunder rolled over the mountain again, but this time it sounded far away. Hours passed. She sat beside him, wiping his forehead, humming softly the same tune she used to calm herself in blindness. Outside, the storm began to die. At one point, he stirred and said, "You went out there without seeing a thing. Weren't you scared?" She smiled faintly. "I was terrified. But fear don't stop love from walking forward." He reached for her hand, his rough fingers wrapping around hers. "You're something else, Lydia. Folks said I was a fool, but I reckon I married the bravest woman in Wyoming." She chuckled softly. "Then we're even. You're the only man fool enough to believe a blind woman could be more than what she seems." Lightning flashed one last time to the window, lighting their faces, his line with exhaustion and awe, hers glowing with quiet strength. The mountain had tested them both, and they had held fast. The morning after, when dawn came, the storm was gone. Mist rose off the valley like smoke from a sleeping giant. The cabin roof had held. The trees stood glistening, and the world felt washed clean. Eli tried to stand, but winced. Lydia was already beside him, steadying him. "Easy," she said. "One step at a time." He smiled through the pain. "Seems like that's how we do everything, don't it?" "That's how all good things are done," she said. Outside, the first sunlight touched the river, the same river that had nearly claimed him. The water gleamed gold now, peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. They stood on the porch, hand in hand. Eli turned to her, voice thick with emotion. "You walked into a storm blind, Lydia. What made you sure you'd find me?" She tilted her head, listening to the wind whisper through the pines. "Because love's louder than thunder." He laughed softly, pulling her close. "Reckon you're right." And in that moment, the world seemed to still. The birds just waking, the mountains catching fire with sunrise, the air sweet with rain and pine. The storm had come to break them. Instead, it bound them tighter. That morning, down in town, the story spread like wildfire. The blind wife who braved the storm and found her husband in the dark. No one mocked them after that. Not ever again. Years passed after the storm. Quiet, faithful years that changed everything and everyone who had once mocked them. The mountain cabin became something of a landmark. Travelers passing through Wind River would pause at the trading post, hear whispers about the blind woman who sees with her heart, and the mountain man who married courage itself. But to Eli and Lydia, it was never legend. It was life. Simple, hard, beautiful life. A new season. By the time autumn returned, Eli's limp had faded. He still bore the faint scar on his leg from the storm night, but he called it his proof of grace. Lydia had learned the mountain's language, the way wind changed before rain, how to tell a hawk's cry from an eagle's, how to tell time by the warmth of the sun on her face. Each morning she would walk the ridge path, hand gliding over the tall grass, the sound of the valley below like a song she never tired of hearing. Eli would watch her from the porch, pride and tenderness in his eyes. One morning, she called back to him, "Do you ever think they still talk about us down there?" He grinned. "Probably. Folks in town need something to fill their coffee time." She laughed. "Then I hope they talk about the right things." He raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Like how love can build a home stronger than timber." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's worth talking about." The return to town. Late that fall, the Thorne family, the same who once mocked them, sent a messenger up the mountain. The town school had lost its teacher to illness. The children had no one to read to them, no one to guide their lessons. They wanted to ask Lydia if she'd come down twice a week, not to teach by sight, but by sound and heart. Eli was wary at first. "You don't owe them nothing," he said. "I know," she replied, "but maybe they need to learn how to see." So they went. The first day Lydia walked into the small schoolhouse, the room fell silent. Children stared, not out of mockery, but of wonder. She moved gently among them, her hands finding the desks, her voice soft but commanding. "Some of you see with your eyes," she said, smiling. "But if you listen close, you'll learn to see with your hearts, too." She taught them more than reading and numbers. She taught them how to feel stories, to describe colors by warmth, to imagine faces by kindness. And soon, every child in town was talking about the teacher who could see the soul. Even Henry Thorne's boy came home one day and said, "Pa, she told me God paints the world with sound. You can hear the blue in the sky if you're quiet enough." That night, Henry sat long by the fire, silent, remembering his old words, and feeling the burn of shame in them. Winter's gift. Winter came hard again. But this time, the town didn't forget the mountain. Every few weeks, someone rode up with supplies, sugar, flour, kerosene, even fabric Lydia could sew into blankets. The people who had once laughed now called her Miss Lydia with respect in their voices. On Christmas Eve, they invited Eli and Lydia to town for a special service. The church was small, the pews filled with neighbors. Lanterns flickered, wreaths hung in the windows. As the pastor spoke of light overcoming darkness, he paused and said, "And sometimes that light walks among us, not in the eyes, but in the heart. Tonight, we honor two people who showed us what love truly looks like." All eyes turned to Eli and Lydia. She stood, shy but smiling, and said softly, "We didn't do nothing special. We just kept believing that the world can still be kind." The room was silent for a heartbeat. Then came applause, slow and rising, warm as sunlight. Years later, time rolled on, as it always does. The mountain cabin grew older, its logs silvered by weather and memory. Eli's hair turned white. Lydia's stayed brown, streaked with silver, and though her eyes never saw again, they shone with a calmness that made people feel seen. Sometimes travelers would find their way up the ridge, young couples, widows, drifters, looking for advice. Lydia would pour them tea and listen, her hands folded in her lap. Eli would sit nearby, carving wood, saying little. When they left, they always said the same thing. "I came up the mountain lost, but I'm leaving found." And Lydia would smile to herself, whispering, "That's how it should be." The last morning, one spring morning, Eli woke before dawn. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft sound of Lydia's breathing beside him. He lay there a long time, watching the light change on her face. When she stirred, she smiled. "You're watching me again." "Guilty," he said softly. "You look peaceful." "I dreamed we were dancing again," she murmured. He smiled. "We'll dance again soon, I promise." They spent that day like any other, feeding the hens, mending fences, laughing at small things. But as evening fell, Lydia sat on the porch, her hand finding his. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" "The mountain singing. It's saying thank you." Eli looked out over the valley, golden in the sunset. "Maybe it's you it's thanking, darling." She smiled faintly. "No, it's us." And as the stars began to appear one by one, she leaned her head against his shoulder. That was how she went. Quiet, warm, with a smile on her lips, the song of the mountain fading gently into silence. The legend of the ridge. Eli buried her beneath the old pine that overlooked the valley, her favorite spot. He carved the words himself into the stone. She saw the world not with her eyes, but with her soul, and found beauty everywhere. For years afterward, folks from town would climb that mountain trail to lay wildflowers by her grave. They said that on certain mornings, when the sun hit the ridge just right, you could almost see her silhouette in the mist, standing tall beside her mountain man, hand in hand, looking out over the land they tamed together. And when children asked who she was, their parents would smile and say, "She was the woman who taught this town how to see." The legend of the mountain man and his blind wife became part of the valley story, told by firesides, whispered to new lovers, remembered whenever the storms came fierce and folks needed reminding that love can outlast the dark. And up on that ridge, where pine and sky meet, the wind still carries her laughter, soft, steady, eternal, because even the blind can show the world the way.